On that rainy evening, a CEO was rushing to the most important board meeting of his life. He had no idea that stopping for just 1 minute at a lonely bus stop would destroy everything he believed about himself. A grieving mother, a little girl holding a worn stuffed rabbit, and an old silver locket that should never have been around a stranger's neck. Sometimes a single chance encounter is more powerful than money, success, or an entire empire. But is one man willing to lose everything just to do the right thing for the first time? Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Your support helps new stories come out much faster. Rain had a way of making New York look honest. It stripped the shine off the glass towers, blurred the gold lettering on expensive doors, turned sidewalks into dark mirrors where people hurried past their own reflections. The city smelled of wet asphalt, overheated engines, coffee gone bitter in paper cups, and the metallic breath of the subway grates. Ethan Cole sat in the back of a black town car, untouched by any of it. His charcoal coat lay folded beside him. His suit was dry, sharp, expensive enough to make silence feel like a privilege. In one hand he held his phone. In the other, a tablet glowing with numbers, contracts, deadlines. "No, Daniel," he said, his voice flat. "I don't want explanations. I want the permits signed before Monday." Daniel Pierce said something on the other end. Ethan looked out at the rain crawling down the window. "Then make them understand," he answered. "That is what I pay you for." A pause. "No, don't bring me sentiment. Sentiment doesn't keep a company alive." He ended the call before Daniel finished speaking. The car rolled toward the next intersection and stopped under a red light. A bus hissed at the curb, its brakes sighing like an old animal. People gathered beneath the narrow shelter, shoulders raised, faces lowered. Then Ethan saw her. A woman sat at the far end of the bus stop, away from the others, as if even grief needed to keep its distance. Her beige coat was soaked through at the sleeves. One hand held a cheap plastic bag. The other arm was wrapped around a small girl with a pink backpack and a worn gray rabbit hanging from one strap. The woman was crying quietly, not loudly enough to be helped, just enough to be seen by anyone who still remembered how to look. Ethan turned his face away. The light changed. "Drive," he said. The car moved forward, 10 feet, 20. The girl at the bus stop lifted her head. Her eyes followed the traffic, wide and dark, too still for a child. She wasn't crying. That was worse. Ethan closed his tablet. "Stop the car." The driver glanced into the mirror. "Sir?" "Stop. There's no standing here." Ethan looked at him once. The driver pulled over. A moment later, Ethan stepped out into the rain. It struck his shoulders, cold and immediate. By the time he reached the bus shelter, the edges of his coat had darkened with water. The woman looked up. Her eyes were green, red at the rims, and tired in a way sleep could not fix. The little girl pressed closer to her side. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked. The woman gave a short, humorless laugh. "Do I look all right?" "No." That seemed to surprise her more than politeness would have. Ethan glanced at the child. "Do you have somewhere to go?" The woman's jaw tightened. "We're waiting." "For who?" She looked past him into the rain. "For morning, I guess." Ethan said nothing. The girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, I'm cold." The woman immediately bent toward her, rubbing the child's small hands between her own. "I know, Lily. I know, baby. Just a little longer." Ethan noticed her hands then, red from the cold. No gloves, no ring. "I can call you a cab," he said, "or take you somewhere safe." The woman looked back at him. "People like you always say that like safety is an address." He absorbed that quietly. "What's your name?" She hesitated. "Mara Bennett." "And your daughter?" "Lily." The child lowered her eyes, holding the rabbit by one torn ear. "I'm Ethan Cole." Mara went very still. Something in her face changed. Not recognition exactly. more like a wound remembering where the knife had entered. "I know who you are," she said. Ethan frowned. "You do?" She reached into her bag with shaking fingers and pulled out a damp envelope. The paper was soft from rain, the ink bruised at the edges. She handed it to him without looking away. Ethan opened it. At the top was his company's name, Cole and Hartwell Development. Below it, the address of a residential building marked for demolition, a notice of eviction, a legal stamp, a final deadline, and at the bottom, a signature. Daniel Pierce. Ethan read it twice. The rain tapped on the roof of the bus shelter. Somewhere behind him, a taxi horn blared and faded. "This was executed today?" he asked. Mara's mouth trembled, but her voice stayed steady. "This morning, 2 men came with boxes. One of them told my daughter to choose one toy. One." She looked down at the rabbit. "She chose that." Ethan held the paper tighter. "There should have been relocation payments." "There were promises." "That isn't the same thing." "No," Mara said. "It really isn't." For the first time in years, Ethan had no clean answer ready. He looked at Lily. The girl was staring at him now, not afraid exactly, but watchful, as if she had already learned that adults often came dressed as solutions and left behind worse problems. "I didn't know," Ethan said. Mara's eyes hardened. "That must be comfortable." The words landed without volume, and somehow that made them heavier. Ethan looked back at the document. His company, his name, his profit, someone else's night in the rain. "I can fix this," he said. Mara shook her head slowly. "You can't fix tonight." Lily coughed, a dry little sound that made Mara turn at once. "Baby?" "I'm okay," Lily whispered, but she wasn't. Her lips had a faint bluish tint. Her backpack looked too heavy for her thin shoulders. Ethan took one step closer. "Let me get you both out of the rain." Mara didn't move. Pride held her upright. Fear kept her rooted. And behind both, something more painful. The exhaustion of having been forced to distrust every open hand. Then Lily spoke, barely above the rain. "Mommy said good people don't walk past." Mara closed her eyes. Ethan looked at the child. A small silver chain rested against the collar of her jacket. At the end of it hung a metal-shaped charm, a leaf, delicate and old, darkened in the tiny grooves by time. Ethan stopped breathing for a second. He knew that leaf. He knew the curve of its stem, the tiny crack near the edge, the way the silver caught light even in weather like this. His mother had worn one exactly like it. No, not exactly like it. That one. Ethan stared at the medallion while the rain beat softly around them, and the city seemed to pull back, leaving only the child, the silver leaf, and a dead woman's secret hanging between them. Ethan did not take them to a hotel. He told himself it was because a hotel would require names, questions, records. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit. After seeing Lily shiver under that bus shelter, a clean room with a numbered door felt like another form of abandonment. So he brought them home. The iron gates opened without a sound. The town car moved up a long driveway washed silver by rain. Mara sat stiffly beside Lily, one hand resting on her daughter's knee, as if she expected the world to take even that if she loosened her grip. Lily stared out the window. "Is this a museum?" she whispered. Mara didn't answer. Ethan heard it. The house rose in front of them, all stone, glass, and careful lighting, beautiful from a distance, unforgiving up close. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood, expensive candles, and rooms no one entered unless paid to clean them. Lily stepped into the marble hall and stopped. Her wet sneakers squeaked against the floor. "Mommy," she said softly, "am I allowed to stand here?" Something moved across Mara's face. Pain, quickly hidden. "Yes, baby, you're allowed." Ethan turned away too late. He had already heard it. A house like his was built to impress people. For the first time, it embarrassed him. "I'll have rooms prepared," he said. "Dry clothes, food." Mara looked at him. "We're not a charity case." "I didn't say you were." "You didn't have to." Her voice was calm, but it had sharp edges. Ethan was used to people softening around him. Employees, investors, even rivals. Mara did not soften. She stood in his house, soaked to the skin, and still somehow made him feel like the intruder. Lily coughed then. A small, tight cough. Mara turned immediately. "Lily?" "I'm okay," the girl murmured, but her breathing had changed. It was shallow now, careful. Mara opened the backpack, searched once, then again, faster. "No," she whispered. Ethan stepped closer. "What is it?" Mara didn't look at him. "Her inhaler." "Where is it?" "In the apartment." Her hands shook as she opened every pocket. "Or in one of the boxes. Or in the trash. I don't know. Your men threw everything together." "My men?" "Your company. Your papers. Your signature somewhere high enough that no one had to look us in the eye." Lily coughed again, harder this time. Ethan's face changed. He pulled out his phone. "I need a pediatric doctor at my house now," he said. "And a pharmacy delivery. Asthma medication, inhalers, nebulizer, whatever they need. Now." Mara watched him. "Money makes people move fast, doesn't it?" Ethan lowered the phone slowly. "So does fear. For people like you, maybe." He took the hit because it was deserved. Within half an hour, the house had more movement than it had seen in months. A doctor arrived with damp hair and a black medical bag. A pharmacy courier came next. A housekeeper found towels, blankets, soup, children's pajamas still in packaging because Ethan had ordered them for some charity event and forgotten. Lily sat on the edge of a guest bed while the doctor listened to her lungs. "Deep breath, sweetheart," he said. Lily looked at Mara first. Mara nodded. Only then did the child obey. Ethan stood in the doorway. He did not belong in that room. He knew it. Mara knew it. Even Lily, with her solemn eyes, seemed to know it. Later, when Lily finally slept, the house returned to silence, but it was no longer the same silence. Mara sat in the kitchen with both hands around a mug of tea. She hadn't changed out of her old beige coat. It hung open now, wet at the cuffs, stubborn as its owner. Ethan stood near the island. The kitchen was enormous, all dark stone and brushed steel, a place designed for photographs, not hunger. "She's stable," he said. Mara stared into the tea. She shouldn't have needed a doctor tonight. No, she shouldn't have. That answer made her look up. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan asked, "Why were you still in the building? There should have been notices. Relocation support." Mara gave a tired smile. "There were notices. There were meetings. There were men in suits who called us residents, like it was a disease they were trying not to catch." Ethan said nothing. "My mother lived in that building for 30 years, Mara continued. "I grew up there. Lily took her first steps in that hallway. The radiator screamed all winter. The elevator broke twice a month. And Mrs. Alvarez on the 3rd floor cooked with so much garlic you could smell dinner through the walls." She paused. "It wasn't much, but it was ours." Ethan looked down. "Daniel handled the acquisition." Mara's eyes sharpened. "That's convenient." "It isn't an excuse." "No, but it is how men like you survive yourselves." He looked at her then. "Men like me?" "Yes," she said. "Men who build towers and call it progress. Men who never see what gets buried under the foundation." The words settled between them. Ethan's voice was lower when he spoke. "If Daniel promised compensation, I'll find the records." Mara laughed once, without warmth. "The records disappeared." "Documents don't just disappear." "People do. Paper is easy." He had no answer for that. Mara leaned back, exhausted but still upright. "You want proof. Everyone wants proof. Proof that we paid rent. Proof that we were promised help. Proof that the lock was changed before I could get Lily's medicine. Proof that a child cried in the rain because adults found a legal way to be cruel." Her eyes shone, but she did not cry. Then she said quietly, "Poor people rarely have proof, Mr. Cole. We only have consequences." The kitchen seemed to shrink around them. Ethan had spent his life inside rooms where consequences were discussed in percentages: delay costs, legal exposure, public risk. He had never heard the word sound like a child's cough in the dark. "My mother used to say," Mara added, "that people with power never believe damage until it reaches their own door." Ethan looked at her. "What was your mother's name?" Mara hesitated. "Anna Bennett." The name touched something old in him, but he couldn't place it. Not yet. Before he could ask more, a soft sound came from the hallway. "Mom?" Mara stood at once. Lily was there in the doorway, barefoot, swallowed by oversized pajamas. In one hand she held the worn rabbit, in the other the silver leaf medallion. "It opened," she said. Ethan went still. Mara crossed to her. "What opened, baby?" "The necklace." Lily held it out. The tiny silver leaf had split along a hidden seam. Inside was a photograph, faded almost to sepia. The edges were worn thin, the faces softened by years. Mara frowned, confused. Ethan stepped closer. The kitchen light caught the image. A young woman stood beneath a tree, smiling with the kind of tired tenderness that belonged to mothers who gave more than they kept. Beside her was a boy of 7 or 8 in a dark school coat, frowning at the camera, one hand trapped inside hers. Ethan did not move. The room, the rain, Mara's voice, the doctor's bag upstairs, everything fell away. He knew that boy. He knew the stiff collar, the stubborn mouth, the frightened eyes trying to look older than they were. And he knew the woman, her hand, her smile, the silver leaf at her throat, his mother. Lily looked up at him. "Do you know her?" Ethan tried to answer, but the past had opened in a child's palm, and for the first time in decades, Ethan Cole had no place to hide. Morning arrived quietly. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the city wrapped in a pale gray light. Through the tall windows of Ethan Cole's dining room, Manhattan looked washed clean, but not renewed. The streets still carried yesterday's puddles, and the rooftops held the cold, like old resentment. Ethan had barely slept. The silver leaf medallion lay on the table beside his untouched coffee. He had opened and closed it a dozen times during the night, hoping fatigue had distorted what he had seen. It hadn't. The faded photograph was real. The woman smiling into the camera was his mother. The boy standing beside her was him. And somehow, after more than 30 years, the photograph had found its way into the hands of a little girl who had spent the previous evening sleeping under his roof because his own company had thrown her out of hers. Nothing about it made sense. Footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Mara entered the dining room quietly, wearing the same beige coat folded neatly over one arm. She had borrowed a sweater from the housekeeper, but she looked uncomfortable in it, as though expensive fabric belonged to someone else's life. "You've been awake all night," she observed. Ethan looked at the cup in front of him. "I wasn't interested in sleeping." Neither was she. For a moment, they simply occupied the same silence. Lily's laughter drifted faintly from the living room, where one of the housekeepers was helping her build a castle out of empty shipping boxes. It was a small sound, hesitant, almost unfamiliar inside a house that had spent years echoing only with footsteps and closing doors. Ethan realized something that unsettled him more than the medallion. His home sounded different with a child inside it. He picked up the necklace. "Mara." She looked at the photograph. "I've never seen the inside before." "You didn't know?" "My mother never opened it. She pulled out a chair but didn't sit immediately. She always said it wasn't hers. Ethan's eyes lifted. What exactly did she say? Mara lowered herself into the chair. When I was little, I asked why she never wore jewelry except that necklace. A faint smile appeared on her face. She told me. Mara paused, hearing the memory before speaking it. One day you'll meet the family it belongs to. Until then, I am only keeping it safe. The room became impossibly still. Ethan stared at her. What was your mother's full name? She hesitated. Anna Bennett. The name settled inside him like a forgotten key, finally finding the right lock. He was 8 years old again, not in this mansion. In the old brick apartment building his father had purchased before anyone called him a real businessman. He remembered polished shoes stepping over broken stairs, lawyers carrying folders, families carrying boxes, and among them, a thin little girl with dark braids sitting alone on the front steps, hugging her knees. Anna. His mother had noticed her before anyone else had. Sometimes, when his father worked late, she packed an extra sandwich, or a blanket, or medicine. She never called it charity. She called it refusing to become like your father. One evening, Ethan had asked why she kept helping strangers. His mother had smiled sadly. Because one day you'll own things, Ethan. What kind of things? Houses, land, companies. He had nodded proudly. She touched his cheek. When that day comes, promise me you'll never forget that every building is full of someone's memories before it becomes part of someone's business. He had promised. Children always mean their promises. Adults simply learn how to bury them. I remember her, Ethan whispered. Mara looked at him carefully. You knew my mother? I knew a little girl. He swallowed. My father bought her building. Mara already understood the rest before he spoke it aloud. And your father forced everyone out. Ethan closed his eyes. Yes. She didn't accuse him. She didn't need to. The truth itself was enough. Before either of them could continue, the front door opened. Confident footsteps crossed the marble floor. No hesitation. No announcement. Daniel Pierce entered the house carrying a leather briefcase as though he belonged there. He looked perfectly composed in a navy suit that probably cost more than many families earned in a month. His smile appeared before his greeting. There you are. His eyes landed briefly on Mara. Recognition flashed. It disappeared just as quickly. So, Daniel said lightly, the rumors were true. Ethan remained seated. What rumors? That our famously disciplined CEO spent the night entertaining tenants from a condemned property. Mara's expression hardened. Daniel offered her a polite smile that somehow felt colder than open hostility. No offense intended. She met his gaze. None taken. You must be Ms. Bennett. I must be. Daniel nodded pleasantly. I sincerely regret your circumstances. No, Mara replied evenly. You regret that I'm standing in your boss's dining room. The smile remained on Daniel's face. Only his eyes changed. He turned back toward Ethan. The board meeting starts in 45 minutes. I know. Then let's go. I'm not finished here. Daniel sighed almost affectionately. Ethan. He placed his briefcase on the table. This family was legally removed from a property scheduled for redevelopment. He looked toward Mara. There were contracts. There were signatures. There were deadlines. He spread his hands. Business. Mara answered before Ethan could. My daughter lost her asthma medication. Daniel nodded once. Unfortunate. My home. Replaceable. My mother's memories. No market value. The words were delivered calmly, without anger, without pleasure, as if he were explaining accounting principles. Ethan watched him, really watched him. For years he had admired Daniel's efficiency, his discipline, his ability to make difficult decisions without hesitation. Now he understood what he had mistaken for strength. It wasn't strength. It was absence. Absence of doubt. Absence of conscience. Absence of imagination. Because only someone who had forgotten how another person could hurt would ever reduce a child's home to a line in a financial report. Ethan stood. "Did you personally approve the Bennett eviction?" Daniel didn't blink. "I approved hundreds. I'm asking about this one." "I signed it." "You knew there was a child." "I knew there was an occupied unit." The distinction landed heavily. "You promised relocation assistance." "I promised nothing that wasn't legally required." "You erased the compensation." Daniel smiled again. "Can you prove that?" Silence. Then Ethan spoke. "Get out." Daniel looked genuinely surprised. "I'm sorry?" "You heard me." "Ethan, I said get out of my house." The room froze. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to Daniel Pierce without calculation, without diplomacy, without fear. Daniel picked up his briefcase slowly. "You've changed remarkably in 12 hours. "No." Ethan's voice was quiet. "I've started paying attention." Daniel walked toward the entrance. At the doorway, he stopped. Without turning around, he said, "The board doesn't reward sentiment." Ethan remained silent. Daniel glanced back over his shoulder. "They're already asking questions." "What questions?" "Whether you're still capable of protecting this company." A faint smile touched his lips. "Or whether you've become a liability." The front door closed. The house felt strangely larger after he left. Mara looked toward Ethan. "He won't stop." "No. He'll make this personal." Ethan stared at the medallion still lying on the dining table. "He already has." As if summoned by the thought, his phone began vibrating. The screen displayed his executive secretary's name. He answered. "This is Ethan." The woman's voice was strained. "Mr. Cole, I'm sorry to call before the meeting." "What happened?" A pause. Then, "Mr. Pierce submitted evidence to the board early this morning." Ethan's expression didn't change. "What kind of evidence?" "He claims you've authorized unauthorized financial transfers connected to the Bennett redevelopment project." Ethan's fingers tightened around the phone. "That's impossible." "He says company funds were diverted under your approval." Another silence. Then, very quietly, "The board has suspended the normal agenda." "They're opening a formal investigation." Ethan looked through the window at the city he had spent 20 years helping build. For the first time, the towers no longer looked permanent. They looked like structures balanced on invisible fractures, strong only until the ground beneath them decided to move. Daniel hadn't come to defend himself. He had come to strike first, and Ethan understood, with perfect clarity, that the battle ahead was no longer about one eviction, one family, or one forgotten promise. Someone had begun dismantling his life with the same efficiency they once dismantled other people's. The difference was that this time, he finally knew what it felt like to stand on the losing side. The boardroom occupied the entire top floor. Glass walls overlooked Manhattan from 3 directions. Steel columns disappeared into a ceiling so high, it seemed designed to remind everyone inside how insignificant they were supposed to feel. A table of polished black walnut stretched through the center of the room, surrounded by leather chairs worth more than most people's annual salaries. Everything reflected light. Nothing reflected warmth. Ethan Cole stood alone at one end of the table. Across from him sat 9 board members. To his right stood Daniel Pierce. Perfect tie, perfect posture, perfect confidence. If someone had walked into the room without knowing the truth, they would have mistaken him for the man trying to save the company. The chairman adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Pierce," he said, "you may begin." Daniel nodded graciously. "Thank you." He tapped a remote. The screen behind him lit up with spreadsheets, banking records, authorization forms, digital signatures, rows of numbers, columns of transfers, official company seals. At first glance, everything looked flawless. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel began calmly, "I wish these circumstances were different." A practiced pause. "Our company has always been built on discipline. We don't make decisions based on emotion. We make them based on responsibility." He looked toward Ethan. "Unfortunately, over the last several days, Mr. Cole has allowed personal involvement with individuals connected to the Bennett redevelopment project to influence executive decisions." Another click. A transfer appeared on the screen. Then another. Then another. "These transactions," Daniel continued, "show unauthorized movement of company funds intended to delay legally approved redevelopment." One of the directors frowned. "The approvals carry Mr. Cole's signature." Another leaned forward. "They do." Every pair of eyes turned toward Ethan. He stepped closer to the screen. His signature was there. Every curve, every stroke. Perfect. Too perfect. He looked at the dates, the timestamps, the formatting. Something was wrong. Not obvious. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But he signed hundreds of documents every month. He knew his own habits. "I didn't authorize these." Daniel folded his hands. "Of course. They're forged." Another faint smile. "A serious accusation." "They're fake. The signatures appear authentic." "They appear authentic because someone studied them." Silence settled across the room. The chairman cleared his throat. "Mr. Cole, unless you can provide evidence." The conference room doors opened. No one had announced a visitor. The security staff outside hadn't stopped her. An elderly woman stepped inside wearing a simple dark coat, still damp from the morning air. She carried no expensive briefcase, only an old cardboard archive folder tied shut with faded blue ribbon. Grace Miller. Time had bent her shoulders slightly, but not her gaze. Ethan stared. Grace? He had not seen her in over 20 years. She had tucked him into bed when he was a boy. Bandaged, scraped knees. Read stories his father called a waste of time. His mother trusted her more than anyone. Every conversation stopped. Daniel frowned. "I'm sorry," he said smoothly. "This is a private meeting." Grace looked at him only briefly. "No." Her voice was gentle. "But the truth isn't." She walked directly toward Ethan. The folder looked fragile. The cardboard had yellowed with age. The corners were soft from decades of being carried, hidden, protected. It looked insignificant, yet somehow Ethan felt its weight before it ever touched his hands. Grace placed it in front of him. "Your mother asked me to keep this." He looked up. "For when?" Her eyes never left his. "For the day you stopped looking like your father." The words entered the room without being spoken loudly. No one interrupted. No one moved. Ethan untied the ribbon. Inside were handwritten letters, photographs, legal copies, property agreements, newspaper clippings, receipts, and beneath everything else, an old cassette tape. Grace nodded toward it. "Play it." Daniel's expression changed for the first time, only slightly, but Ethan noticed. He found an old digital converter kept in the conference room archives for legal recordings and connected the tape. Static filled the speakers, then voices, young voices. One belonged to Ethan's father. He recognized it instantly, confident, impatient, certain the world existed to be purchased. The second voice, Daniel, much younger, still unmistakable. Laughter echoed through the speakers, then his father's voice. "How many families are left?" Daniel answered casually. 7. "They'll leave. They're asking about compensation." A laugh. "They always ask." Another voice. "What if they sue?" Daniel laughed again. "With what money?" More laughter. Then Ethan's father spoke. "They'll forget." Daniel answered without hesitation. "Poor people always do." The tape clicked softly as it reached its end. No one in the boardroom spoke. The silence afterward was heavier than the recording itself. Ethan stood perfectly still. His entire career had been built on one belief, that his father had been ruthless because business required it. Now he understood. His father had not confused profit with cruelty. He had chosen cruelty because it was profitable. And Daniel hadn't learned from him. He had inherited him. Ethan looked at Grace. "My mother knew." Grace nodded. "She tried to stop him." "Why didn't she tell me?" "I tried." Her voice trembled for the first time. "So did she." A long pause. "Your father sent you away to boarding school." She looked toward the windows. "When you came home, you only wanted to become him." Those words struck harder than the recording, because they were true. He had spent years admiring the wrong parent, not because he lacked love, because he lacked courage. Daniel stepped forward at last. "This proves nothing." Nobody answered. He tried again. "It's an edited recording." Still nothing. One director slowly removed his glasses. Another closed the financial report in front of him. The chairman looked toward Ethan. "What are you going to do?" Ethan closed the folder carefully, almost reverently. Then he looked directly at Daniel. "The Bennett redevelopment project is suspended immediately." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake. Every family displaced by that project will receive full compensation." "Ethan, independent auditors will examine every transaction authorized under your supervision." Daniel took one step forward. "You don't have the authority." "I do." "You'll destroy shareholder confidence." Ethan's voice remained calm. "I'd rather lose investors than lose whatever is left of my conscience." Another silence. Then, "Daniel Pierce." Ethan didn't raise his voice. "You are terminated, effective immediately." The words hung in the room. Daniel looked around the table. No one defended him. No one even met his eyes. For the first time in years, he stood alone. He smiled. It wasn't pleasant. It wasn't angry. It was the smile of a man who had prepared for losing one battle because he believed he had already arranged the next. "You've become emotional," he said quietly. "No," Ethan answered. "I've become awake." Daniel picked up his briefcase. Before reaching the door, he looked back. "You still don't understand." "What?" "You think today was about your company." Then he left. The door closed behind him. Ethan released a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Across the room, near the entrance, Mara stood silently. She had witnessed everything. Not triumph, not revenge. Only the painful collapse of a man discovering that the foundation beneath his entire life had never been stone. Only borrowed concrete poured over someone else's suffering. Grace gently rested one hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Your mother would have been proud." He lowered his eyes. "I don't deserve that." "No." Grace's voice remained soft. "But perhaps you're finally trying." At that exact moment, Ethan's phone vibrated. Once, then again. He glanced down. The first message came from his home security chief. "Mr. Cole, we've searched the entire property. Lily Bennett is gone. Miss Bennett is looking everywhere. We can't find her." The blood drained from Ethan's face. "Mara." She saw his expression before he spoke. "What happened?" He didn't answer. The phone vibrated again. Unknown number. One new message. "If you want to see the little girl alive, come alone." A second message appeared before he could breathe. "No police, no board members, no heroes. Come alone." For the first time that day, Ethan forgot the boardroom, forgot the company, forgot the millions. Because somewhere beyond the walls of glass and polished leather, a little girl with a worn rabbit backpack had disappeared, and someone already knew exactly how to use her as the most valuable leverage of all. The old Bennett house stood exactly where the city had tried to forget it. Its broken windows reflected strips of lightning. Rain slipped through the collapsed roof, dripping into rusted buckets and shattered hallways that had once carried children's footsteps, birthday songs, arguments over dinner, ordinary lives. Now there was only water and silence. Ethan parked across the street. He turned off the engine but remained still for several seconds. The windshield wipers swept once, then stopped. He looked at the message one last time. Come alone. For the first time in many years, he had no lawyers to call, no board to convince, no contract to negotiate. Only a frightened little girl waiting somewhere inside a dying building. He stepped into the rain. Every floorboard groaned beneath his shoes as he entered the lobby. Pieces of plaster lay scattered across the cracked tiles. Old apartment numbers still clung to doors that no longer led to homes. Someone had painted over memories, but memories have a way of showing through. "Lily?" Ethan called quietly. Only the rain answered. He moved deeper inside. Then, a small voice. "Mr. Cole?" It came from upstairs. He climbed the damaged staircase slowly. The second floor had almost completely collapsed. Water dripped through exposed beams. Wind pushed loose plastic sheeting against broken windows, with soft, hollow sounds that resembled distant breathing. At the end of the corridor stood Daniel Pierce. His coat was soaked. His hair, usually immaculate, clung to his forehead. For the first time since Ethan had known him, perfection had abandoned him. Beside him stood Lily. She wasn't tied. She wasn't crying. She held the worn gray rabbit against her chest with both hands, standing very still, as children sometimes do when fear becomes too large for tears. Daniel rested one hand lightly on her shoulder, not to comfort, to remind. "You came alone." "I did." Daniel smiled faintly. "I knew you would." Ethan kept his eyes on Lily. "Come here." Daniel shook his head. "Not yet." The rain tapped steadily through the broken ceiling. "You destroyed everything." Ethan answered quietly. "No. I stopped you." Daniel laughed. "You still don't understand." His voice echoed through the empty hallway. "You think companies are built on kindness?" "No. They're built on sacrifice. They shouldn't be built on innocent people." Daniel looked almost disappointed. "You've become sentimental." "I've become responsible." Daniel's smile disappeared. "You sound just like your mother." For reasons Ethan couldn't fully explain, those words no longer felt like an insult. "They're the first words you've said today that don't shame me." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You know why your father succeeded?" Ethan said nothing. "Because he understood something you never did." Daniel took one slow step backward. "The world doesn't reward compassion." Another step. "It rewards people willing to do what others refuse." Ethan answered after a long silence. "No. It rewards them for a while." The building creaked. A piece of concrete fell somewhere below. Then another voice echoed through the hallway. "Daniel?" "Mara." She stood near the stairwell, soaked by the rain, breathing hard. Her face was pale. She had followed Ethan. Daniel turned sharply. "I told him to come alone." "You did." Mara's voice remained steady despite the fear in it. "But I'm her mother." For one brief second, Daniel looked away from Lily. That was all it took. Ethan moved, not fast, not dramatically, simply without hesitation. He crossed the distance in 2 long strides. "Lily!" The little girl ran. She threw herself toward him with every ounce of trust a frightened child could still possess. Ethan caught her against his chest. At that exact moment, Daniel lunged forward. The sound came first, a deafening crack. One of the weakened ceiling beams gave way under the weight of rainwater. Wood, stone, steel. Everything began falling at once. There was no time to think, no time to calculate, no time to protect anything except the child in his arms. Ethan turned his body, wrapped both arms around Lily, bent over her, and took the impact himself. The beam struck his shoulder. Pain exploded through his side. Dust filled the hallway. Lily screamed, but Ethan never loosened his grip. He remembered something then, not a business meeting, not a contract. His mother, holding his hand, telling him that strength was measured by what a person chose to carry. For the first time in his adult life, he finally understood what she meant. Voices erupted downstairs. "Police! Don't move!" Flashlights cut through the dust. Daniel tried to run. 2 officers intercepted him before he reached the staircase. He struggled, shouted, threatened, promised lawsuits, promised revenge. No one listened. Grace Miller stood near the entrance, rain dripping from her umbrella. She caught Ethan's eye across the ruined hallway. A tiny nod. She had ignored his pride. She had called the police anyway. Later. Much later. An ambulance waited outside. A paramedic wrapped Ethan's injured shoulder. Mara sat beside Lily beneath a blanket. Neither spoke. Finally, Lily climbed down from the stretcher and walked toward Ethan. She looked at the bandage. "Does it hurt?" He smiled gently. "A little." She considered that, then reached out and carefully hugged him. Not because he had saved her, because children recognize sincerity long before adults do. And in that embrace, Ethan felt something he had spent decades trying to purchase in other forms: belonging. 1 month later. The demolition fences surrounding Bennett House disappeared. The city expected luxury apartments. Instead, construction crews began restoring the original structure. The cracked brick remained. The old entrance remained. Even the worn iron railing was repaired instead of replaced. Above the front doors, a simple plaque was installed. The Eleanor Cole Community House, named after the woman who had quietly carried sandwiches into forgotten apartments while others counted profit. Ethan sold a large portion of his shares, not because guilt demanded punishment, because responsibility demanded participation. The Eleanor Cole Foundation began paying legal expenses, emergency housing, medical costs, and relocation assistance for families pushed aside by developments they could never afford. People called it generosity. Ethan never did. He called it overdue. On opening day, children filled the courtyard. Someone played music. Neighbors who had once packed their lives into cardboard boxes carried flower pots through the entrance instead. Lily found Ethan standing alone beneath the old oak tree behind the building. She held something in her small hand. The necklace. He looked down. The silver leaf rested in her palm. "I think," she said carefully, "you should keep it now." He frowned. "It belongs to your family." She shook her head. "It belonged to your mom." He hesitated. "What if I lose it?" Lily smiled in the serious way only children can. "You won't." "How do you know?" "Because now you know what it's for." She placed the medallion into his hand. "So you don't forget." He closed his fingers around the cool silver. "I won't." She believed him immediately. Children rarely ask for guarantees. They simply notice whether someone has changed. As Lily ran back toward Mara, Ethan remained beneath the tree. A breeze moved through the branches. Somewhere nearby, laughter drifted through open windows. Real laughter. The kind that cannot exist inside empty houses. Before leaving, Ethan walked through the restored hallway one last time. Near the community room, dozens of children's drawings covered an entire wall. Crayons, crooked windows, blue skies, stick figures with impossible smiles. One drawing caught his attention. 3 people stood in the rain. A little girl with a rabbit backpack. A woman in a beige coat. A tall man wearing a dark coat. Above them, written in uneven block letters, were 6 simple words. He didn't walk away. Ethan stood there for a long time, not because the drawing was beautiful, because it was honest. He had spent most of his life believing that power changed people. It doesn't. Power only reveals which direction they were already walking. The real change begins much later, in the quiet moment when a person finally chooses to stop walking past someone else's pain. And once that choice is made, there is no honest way back.